Over the past decade, French influence in Africa, once so strong, has been steadily declining. Since 2019, Algeria has been gradually replacing French with English in its education system. In 2023, Mali made its 13 national languages the country's official ones, relegating French to the status of working language. That same year, Gabon's pro-French government was overthrown, while Niger also expelled France.
Eh ben voyons, en voilà encore une qui va nous dire que la France est responsable de tous les maux de l'Afrique.
Well, that's not really the point of the video. However, we can ponder if these political moves indicate the inevitable decline of French in Africa, its replacement with English, or the potential revival of some African languages.
Africa is the continent with the greatest linguistic diversity in the world, second only to Asia. However, after centuries of foreign interference, what remains of Africa's original linguistic map? As of 2024, only Ethiopia, Mali, and Burkina Faso, and the latter ones since 2023 only, had indigenous languages as their official ones. The other 51 states have sometimes alongside African languages at least one foreign tongue designated as their official language, whether Arabic, English, Portuguese, French, or even Spanish. Contrary to many misconceptions, Africa has seen prestigious empires over the centuries, and some regions have a long history of state administration. However, when Europeans divided Africa in 1885, the concept of the nation-state was almost non-existent, with very few exceptions. Indigenous peoples occupied territories with unofficial borders. The borders that were imposed, which have remained unchanged for the most part since 1885, created artificial nations, bringing together diverse and sometimes hostile peoples. This division had significant impacts on Africa's linguistic and political realities, which are still felt today, especially in the Sahel. Local languages that were once so powerful, like Fulani in West Africa, have been gradually marginalized, now occupying minimal space in administratively defined territories. After colonization, the sociolinguistic realities of the newly independent African states varied greatly. Some countries like Rwanda, Tanzania, and Kenya already had a vehicular language and did not need to use a European language to unify the nation. However, this was not the case for most states on the continent, which had to govern diverse and sometimes rival indigenous populations, raising the pressing question of the official tongue, which language to choose so as not to antagonize anyone. Faced with such a situation, most countries on the continent made a pragmatic choice to retain the colonizer's language as the official working tongue in all urban centers.
This means that paradoxically, it is during the period of decolonization that French got to become a truly African language. It was imposed in all administrations, businesses, hospitals, schools, and inevitably spread throughout society with varying degrees of proficiency.
In the latter half of the 20th century, linguistic changes weren't the only shifts happening in Africa. Rapid urbanization radically transformed the demographic, economic, and social landscapes of most African countries. A mass rural exodus drove many workers to the cities, bringing together people with diverse languages. Unable to understand each other, Ivorians, Togolese, and Malians turned to the lingua franca they all knew, French. Over time, French became an integral part of urban multilingualism, while indigenous languages remained dominant in rural areas. This blend of populations and languages, using French as the main means of communication, inevitably led to the emergence of new linguistic forms.
Just like any animal or plant, a language will adapt to its environment and evolve, incorporating elements unique to the region where it is spoken. The wider it spreads, the more significant these adaptations will become with each generation. The accelerated urbanization of Africa led to an unprecedented blend of languages, which inevitably influenced the French language as well. The most notable example is probably Nouchi.
This variety of French originated from the rural exodus of various ethnic groups to Abidjan in the 1980s. Initially seen as a slang used by young delinquents, Nouchi evolved into a trendy argot adopted by the youth of the capital. Some words are borrowed directly from Ivorian languages, others are invented, and some original meanings are transformed.
So, French gradually became an identity language for young people who rejected the normative rules of French, which is often seen as the language of the elite, or those who had a poor knowledge of the grandparents' language. Urbanization thus dramatically impacts the future of languages, altering them formally and leading to the disappearance of some. However, it would be inaccurate to say that acclimatization is the only reality of French in Africa. In Gabon, no local lingua franca has truly emerged, so French remains the main language without being significantly influenced by native languages. Actually, Gabon is one of the very few, if not the only, African countries where a sizable portion of the population has French as their native language. However, how long will this last? In urban centers, it's a matter of competition, and in some places, glottophagy, by which one language absorbs another, might affect French rather than the other way around. This is already happening in Senegal. In major cities like Dakar, Wolof is becoming the main language, even among non-Wolof ethnic groups. In a few years or decades, Wolof might become Senegal's official language, thereby replacing French and putting an end to the history of that language in the country, which was, ironically enough, the first one on the continent to host a French school. However, the outcome of this competition is still undecided, because you see, across the continent, north and south of the Sahara, French as well as English enjoy a major advantage: their role in the social hierarchy. In many African countries, European languages are often seen as prestigious, symbolizing a high social status or a way to achieve it. And you can add to that the fact that African languages rarely enjoy global recognition. So for many African parents, teaching their kids a white man's language can lead to better job opportunities or a brighter future, or so they think. This is probably the reason why no education in Africa is entirely conducted in an African language.
The case of Guinea under Sekou Touré is a good example. After gaining independence, the president had big ambitions for the new state. In 1968, he introduced a major educational reform to gradually incorporate the country's 8 national languages into primary education, while secondary education would remain primarily in French. Despite its progressive intent, this reform was a major failure, largely due to a lack of financial resources, leading to long-lasting negative consequences.
However, these failures shouldn't be seen as inevitable because many African countries do show that multilingualism can work well. For instance, Tanzania has managed to unify the country by making Kiswahili its official language while making education bilingual. In primary school, subjects are taught in Kiswahili, and in secondary school, all subjects are taught in English, but Kiswahili remains important. This is a great way to encourage multilingualism while preserving African languages. Beyond any ethnic, cultural, political, economic questions, languages are living beings that belong to their speakers. In this sense, French is truly an African language.
Ah, c'est l'heure de la minute philo.
As of 2024, Africa has become the leading French-speaking region in the world. But this is also an unprecedented situation because very few Africans have French as their native language. In this context, it's absolutely impossible to consider that Africans won't have a major impact on the French language. Over time, French might be so significantly impacted by these changes that it will turn into distinctly African languages that may someday be called Ivorian or Burkinabe, with very limited mutual intelligibility. Though for now, these African French varieties have had little impact on the French spoken in France. We have also seen that sometimes language is regarded as another form of class struggle in Africa. However, this reality is not set in stone, and languages can be seen as complementary realities rather than conflicting ones. A language is not neutral, as it is associated with a specific world representation. However, this doesn't mean that by learning a specific language you will end up embodying this world representation and just wipe out the one that you developed from birth.
As the Moroccan writer Abdel Fattah Kilitu said, I speak all languages, but in Arabic.
As for the French versus English debate that's been going on in Africa for the past few years, it is difficult to settle. Of course, we can embrace a pragmatic stance and say that English still holds a major role as a global language. And for this very reason, it should be more widely taught across the continent. However, suggesting it should replace French is trivial at best. French has a long administrative, cultural, and historical tradition in Francophone African countries. And the current trend that consists in erasing history to replace it with fiction won't change that. We could say that the ones considering that a specific language shouldn't be learned because it is historically loaded may be paradoxically colonized in their own heads.
What?
When we know that a sizable percentage of Africans, both north and south of the Sahara, are still illiterate, choosing between French and English might not necessarily be the most pressing issue. Regardless, as long as the state as a historical administrative entity exists, it will always need to enforce a unifying language. Whether it is French, English, Portuguese, Spanish, Russian, or even Chinese,
Speak English.
It doesn't matter, because this debate tends to obliterate the necessity of preserving African languages. As a learner of foreign languages, I will always support having more languages than the opposite. So the regional and then international promotion of African languages seems more relevant to me. But I also know it's a very difficult battle because only the most widely spoken languages tend to survive in a multilingual environment. The history of the world since the Neolithic Revolution revolves around the circulation of goods and workers needed for their production and wider distribution. Consequently, the rapid urbanization of African cities will inevitably end up reducing the continent's linguistic diversity, or at least shrinking it significantly. Of course, this phenomenon, which often occurs over 1 or 2 generations, is not unique to Africa. It's been observed in Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas. So it's very likely that in the long run, Africa will only retain the major vehicular languages, which are often foreign to the continent. Even so, we have also seen that a minority language can end up significantly influencing a lingua franca, potentially leading to the creation of a new one. Well, thank you very much for watching this video. If you are African, feel free to share your thoughts on these burning questions in the comments, and I will see you next time.